culture. I think organisational culture in many ways is analogous to the concept of brand. I think if you look maybe 30 or 40 years ago, very little attention was paid to brands and organisational brands, and I think then the concept was not terribly well understood, and it certainly wasn't proactively managed by many organisations. But now it's at the core of organisational thinking and strategy, and I think it's unthinkable for many organisations to let their brand drift in an unmanaged ad hoc way. And I think in a few years' time, in a couple of decades' time, we'll be looking back and thinking the same about culture. How did we survive all those years without proactively taking steps to understand what the cultures are and how we can proactively manage that. I think the important thing to say about culture is it's organisations, it's yours, it's unique. In many ways, it's an organisation's USP. Anyone can copy your strategy, your products, your service, for example, but what they can't copy is your culture. And if you get it right, it attracts the right kind of people to your organisation. It attracts the customers, it retains customers, it motivates your people, determines levels of engagement and performance, and whether your best people stay with you. If you get it right, that's the case. If you get it wrong, your culture may well be stifling change and seriously inhibiting your business performance. And unless you've got a handle on the culture that is operating within your organisation, you may not be aware of its negative impact. Worst still, your culture may be storing up serious issues for you in the future, which I don't think it's overstating to say that they can be potentially existential threats. And as we've seen, that has been the case with some organisations already. So at present, I think for many organisations, they may express a desire to develop a high-performance culture, but what does that actually mean, and what steps do they need to take to ensure that that is the case? And I think until you do that, your culture within your organisation largely controls you, and it controls your decisions and your behaviours and your actions rather than the other way round. And I think it's time to turn the tables, to take control of culture, to understand it, to own it, to manage it, and channel it and nurture it, just like we do for brand at the moment. In a previous life, I worked for HSBC. I was their group head of employee engagement. And that was just following the financial crisis. And there was a pressing need for a variety of reasons to look at culture within the organisation. So as part of my remit, I was looking around to see what tools and approaches there were to assessing culture within organisations, and they fell broadly into two categories. The first category was a fixed sort of psychometric style of tool, which was not flexible. It was a fixed question set generally. You generally needed accreditation to interpret what the results were. They were often based on very sort of very rigid academic models which weren't necessarily that intuitive. So when we're looking at performance and strategic outcomes, they didn't seem to hold the degree of flexibility that was needed to reflect the particular needs of the organisation. And the other extreme, there were a group of tools which were essentially employee surveys, employee engagement surveys with the word engagement crossed out and the word culture written in. Not quite in crayon, but actually not too far away from that. And obviously, those didn't hold the key either to understanding culture. So subsequent to that, over the last 5 years or so, I've been working to develop new approaches to measuring culture which are flexible, tailored to organisational needs, and hopefully help organisations understand and proactively measure the cultures within their organisation. The billing for this webinar was about 5 steps to cracking the cultural change challenge. And here we have the 5 things really which categorize what good looks like in terms of what organizations need to do to develop a good understanding of culture and how it affects performance. The first thing, and perhaps the most important thing overall, is a development of self-awareness. Obviously, you cannot manage what you don't understand. And culture is one of those things that has very profound effects, but is perhaps shrouded in mystery often. So developing that self-awareness about where you are culturally as an organization, where you need to be moving in order to succeed and achieve your strategic objectives is very important. Also aligned to that is individual self-awareness, not exclusively within leadership and management, but particularly around management practices and behaviours. A self-awareness that leads managers to understand what the impact of their behaviours and decisions and management style is on the prevailing culture within the organisation. Does it reinforce the existing culture? If the culture needs to change, what is their role in helping that change happen? The second point to bring out here is about adaptability. Now, culture is not static. Organisations need to change to adapt to the changing demands of the external business environment and society generally. And any organisation that stays where it is culturally is eventually going to find that it's not fit for purpose and it's going to start failing. So adaptability and the ability to change in response to the changing demands put on organisations is absolutely key to maintaining a healthy and appropriate culture. And able to do that, organisations need to have an inclusive culture which allows different perspectives and approaches to be considered, to be raised, to be adopted. This is one of the keys to adaptability that organisations need to develop, and I'll be talking, actually Paul will be talking a little bit about that later. The fourth area there is enablement, which do organisations have the tools to allow those different approaches to have a voice and to involve those different kind of perspectives to come to the surface and be adopted within the organisation. And Paul is going to talk about some tools that Questback can provide to help to facilitate that. And the final point here is around performance. We're not looking at culture change for culture change's sake. We're looking at culture change to drive performance and the achievement of strategy and strategic objectives. So the ability to link performance outcomes to a particular culture, particular organisational and leadership behaviours is absolutely key. And the final thing to point out is this is a circular diagram. This is not a process which stops. It's a continuously feedback loop that continues, and you never really stop because you will never actually be in a position to say we've achieved what we need to and we're where we need to be.
I actually got a question that comes in related to the 5 points from Teresa. She's asked, as culture comes from the top, does the self-awareness that you've proposed, is it at every level? You know, is it proposed analysed at every level?
Yes, I think so. I think the impact of leadership and management on the culture is undeniably one of the strongest elements. But in terms of driving cultural change, it needs to be done all through the organisation. So everybody within the organisation needs to be aware of the changes that they need to make to facilitate the kinds of cultural changes. And I'll be coming on to that in a bit, but absolutely leaders and managers are key. Now, when you're talking about teams, the biggest influence on those are the local managers. But when you're looking at the overall organisation, the influence from the very top is probably the key thing. But that is devolved all the way down through an organisation, from top to bottom. Okay. Self-awareness, as I said, is probably the most important prerequisite of being in the right place in terms of culture and cultural change. The insidious thing about culture is perhaps 90% of it is not directly observable. It's one of those things that happens that operates often at a very clandestine level. And one of my favourite quotations about culture is, if you don't manage your culture, it manages you. And you may not even be aware of the extent to which this is happening. So you really do have to make an effort to uncover what those effects of the culture are in terms of outcomes. And key to that in terms of understanding is at the behavioural level. Behaviours are what are observable. Behaviours set the tone for an organisation. They exemplify the culture and they crystallise the attitudes and the beliefs and the core values. And also behaviours are the level at which you exert an influence. You change behaviours and thereby change attitudes and beliefs. It's that way around. So being able to link culture to specific behaviours is one of the key issues. And particularly, as mentioned in that question, among your leadership and management. The second point to bring out here is culture is often an area shrouded in mystery. It is a very, if you like, nebulous concept. There are certain unhelpful definitions of culture out there which say culture is the way we do things around here, or culture is everything. That may be true, but it doesn't help us develop an understanding about what it is, and it doesn't help us develop a common language to talk about it, to describe it, to articulate where we are and where we need to be. So that is one of the key challenges. There are many models of culture out there. Some are extremely complex. There's one model, I can't remember exactly what it's called at the moment, but it has 120 different dimensions to culture. So if we're going to try and develop a common understanding about what culture is and how it needs to change, that is not terribly helpful. The definition for me of a good model of culture is one that is simple without being simplistic. It has face validity. People can look at it and they intuitively know that it has some merit to it, it has some meaning to it. And crucially, they support the kind of discussions that you need to see happening at all levels within the organisation about what the culture is and how we can change it. And one model for me that fits all of those criteria is a model called the Competing Values Framework by Quinn and Rawbaugh. I think it was from the 1980s. And this is a very commonly used model for precisely those reasons. And the underlying rationale for the model is there's a dynamic tension. There's a dynamic tension between opposing forces, and specifically flexibility and stability and control, and across the other dimension, individualism, or in some cases that's expressed as an external focus, and collectivism, which is the internal focus. And when we look at the quadrants within the model, high stability, high collective organizations we can call a control kind of culture. These are archetypally very well-established large organizations, financial institutions, government departments and the like, with a very hierarchical structure, very predictable and dependable, strong rules and procedures. But on the downside, perhaps a little bit inflexible, perhaps slow to reach decisions, aversion to risk, these kinds of areas. So in each of these quadrants, there's not a good or a bad quadrant. There is good and bad in each. And the key to developing an effective culture is having the right balance between these different areas. Conversely, when we're talking about the obverse of a control culture is a creative type of culture typified by a startup or professional service firms. They're flexible, responsive, they have quite a lack of structure. That may mean they have fairly weak procedures. Potentially they have areas of risk where people are off doing maverick things which may come back to bite you because of that lack of control element. Up in the top left-hand corner, you have a cohesive culture typified by a very democratic style of management. Partnerships and cooperatives tend to fall into this kind of category. They're very strong in the area of involvement and collective decision-making and shared values. But perhaps often suffer from a lack of commercial focus. And sometimes a lack of diversity as well in terms of the thinking involved. And the obverse of that is a competitive culture, very results orientated, very driven, with individual contribution particularly valued over perhaps team contribution, short-term outlook in many cases, and can look at results and profit perhaps over values sometimes. These are typified by sales-driven environments or organizations like investment banks, for example. And as I said, no one of these styles is cultural styles is inherently good or bad, but it's achieving the right kind of balance based on your organizational culture and the desired outcomes. That is the key. Now, I'd just like to start a quick poll, and if we can bring up the poll question, please. Okay. Now, one of the things I said is it needs to be a model that's quite simple, quite intuitive, so hopefully you'll now be in a position to give feedback on where you think you are in terms of your organization, the predominant culture within your organization. Please select one of these, whether you think it's cohesive, creative, competitive, and control. The second part of the question is, are you happy with where your culture, the profile of your culture now, or do you feel that perhaps it needs to change in the future? So if you could select one of those.
I think it's a really interesting exercise, and it's something that I've done on Questback a few times, and the interest, I think, is how long it takes you to actually know and be able to say what your culture is. Because if it takes you a few minutes of thinking about it, then there's a message in that in itself.
I think also another thing to point out is that there'll be a cultural profile across your organization, and you would expect different parts of the organization perhaps to reside within different quadrants, and that's probably quite appropriate. So for example, if you have a sales function, you would expect it to be slightly more competitive. Maybe if you had a creative functions like marketing and internal communications, perhaps you might expect them to be in that creative quadrant. Your financial risk management functions probably more under control. So overall, it's making a generalization about your organization, but in terms of what categorizes this, hopefully this is something that intuitively makes sense and you were able to do.
So far, about 69% of you have voted, so I'll give it another couple of seconds, but there is a question that's come in, well more of a statement from Nick, who said that he believes his culture is control, but he'd like to see it more in the creative direction.
That is not unsurprising. I don't know his organization, I don't know what it's from, but very, very often, particularly large, well-established organizations find themselves in that bottom left-hand quadrant. And culture is self-reinforcing, particularly when you go down to the bottom, and flexibility perhaps is not one of the strengths of the organization. You tend to get stuck in those quadrants and have to make a concerted effort really to move yourself up and to the right. And that's very common across a lot of larger, well-established organizations.
Yeah, and I think it changes over time as well, right?
Absolutely.
If you look back at what was successful, what you needed to be successful in 20, 30 years ago, then control worked pretty well. But in today's changing economic situation, and particularly in developed economies, then it's proving to be. You look at the examples and you look at the businesses who are really smashing it these days, and there's few who have that control kind of culture there.
Absolutely.
Well, most people have voted now, so I'm just going to close it and share the results with you. I think you'll be very interested to see what they've said.
I was secretly hoping this would be the case, so I'm pleased to see this. And this does...
Didn't rig it, though.
No, I certainly didn't. I wouldn't do that. But no, I mean, this does chime with my experience talking to organisations more generally. There is generally a perceived need, particularly amongst the kinds of organisations that I'm working with, who tend to be larger, who tend to be well-established businesses, that there is an issue of control, an issue of complexity, the need to simplify procedures and systems, the need to speed up decision-making and become more flexible. So this really doesn't surprise me. Now, the next key question is, okay, if we're designing an assessment, how do we tap into this? How can we get a picture of where we are and where we need to be in the future?
Yeah. Actually, Callum, what was the yes/no answer? Did you see that?
We haven't watched that one yet.
Oh, right, okay, fine. All right, that's fine. We cover.
Shall we press ahead? I'm conscious of the time. Okay. Can we move the slide on?
Yeah.
Okay, so part of the developing self-awareness is around assessing alignment to the cultural changes that you need to be making and whether people understand what that means for them in their day-to-day work. A very common, typical question in employee surveys and employee engagement surveys is if I understand what the organisational strategy means for me in my day-to-day work. You see this question in a great many employee surveys. It is a very poor question at assessing understanding. Just a tip for those of you who want to get your scores up to particular questions in your employee surveys, use two words at the start of the question, I understand. If you use those two words, people will say they do. People don't like admitting that they don't understand something. So typically you will get a response in the 80s or even 90% in terms of agreeing with the statement. This does not by any means mean that anybody actually or a significant proportion do understand what that means. So we need to be cleverer in the way we ask questions. So typically we might use a two-part question as the one illustrated underneath this one. Now, this is a real question used in anger by a large financial institution in a global survey of all of their people. The situation was that they had a desire to move away from a very regimented approach to decision making based on rules driven by the need for compliance and risk management. What that had led to was experience of customers having a very sort of computer says no interaction with service staff, and also the staff themselves were paralyzed with indecision and couldn't really take decisions for themselves. So first of all, what we asked them to do was to say where they rated the current situation on the continuum from making decisions based on formal rules and policies to personal judgment. And then the second part of the question was, where do you think we need to be to perform at the highest possible level? And the strategy was, we need to move people to the right. We need to move people to a place where they can use more judgment in their decision making rather than just relying on the rule book. So the right answer was only in the context of the strategy. And what they discovered was, while a significant proportion of people understood the need to move to the right, a large number said, we're absolutely fine where we are. We don't need to change. And obviously in the context of culture and cultural change, if people don't feel a certain dissatisfaction with status quo, they're not going to move in that direction. And that was a real test of alignment, if you like. And the follow-up to that was, okay, discussion around what are non-negotiables, what do we have to adhere to in terms of our compliance, and what can we perhaps release the shackles on. And that led to those kinds of discussions which were very important in uncovering what those things were. Moving on, I think we can... Adaptability, yes, as I mentioned, adaptability is key, and specifically around behavioural and leadership styles, and the ability to adopt different leadership styles based on the needs of the organisation. So if we can move on again to the next, I'm just going through because I know I've taken a bit too much time. And the next one again, we all know the quote from Einstein. Okay, what we need to be able to do in terms of the model is to map the different cultural types against different management styles. And if we move on to the next slide. Okay, here is a very typical question from an employee engagement survey. My manager gives me regular feedback on my performance. Yes, he does, strongly agree. He tells me I'm a useless waste of space on a daily basis. Now this may seem like a rather trite question, but actually this brings up a very important point. It's not necessarily do they do it or not. What's much more important from the perspective of culture is how do they do it. So a much better question in uncovering culture and how behaviours relate to that is the example there. When a mistake is made, the first instinct of management is to find out who is responsible and make an example of them, or to use the incident as a learning opportunity, or to implement new processes, procedures to make sure it doesn't happen again, or to let those responsible find a solution and sort it out for themselves. And the option that is chosen to the greatest extent gives you a very clear clue about the predominant management culture. And hopefully that shows you how these kinds of questions can be used in a much more insightful way to uncover what the culture and behaviours are.
Yeah, I think that's really useful. It's a good kind of litmus test of did you get the question right before with the cultural self-assessment. Okay, I think this is on to me, right?
Yeah,
and I'll just say to people, don't panic. I know we said half an hour and we're at 27 minutes and we've only just done number 2, but it does pick up from here, and so bear with us. The next couple of points really are starting to move on a bit more to what you can actually do. How can we practically take this forward, do something with it? And this inclusion point, I think, is really important. It goes back to that first question that somebody asked at the beginning, Callum, around different levels, and are they all the same? Because, I mean, culture is normally voiced from the top. It's normally stated from the top, but actually it has to stick. Any kind of change has to be driven bottom up. It has to include everyone, because the culture, to a certain extent, is a sum of the parts of what everyone does, and all of those attitudes and behaviours that we looked at before. And equally, you can't change culture from the top. You can't send an email out saying, FY everyone, as of today, we've got a new culture, right? So start behaving differently. It doesn't work like that. And you've got to have this inclusion of everyone. And there is a danger, I think, that you latch onto existing things like engagement surveys, and you start saying, okay, great, we'll add a few questions to the annual engagement survey, and that'll tell us about culture. But you can't do that. You have to be in a position where you can go and talk to people specifically about this using the kinds of questions you showed, Andrew. I thought that the slider example was great between the two competing forces. And the other thing I've seen work really effectively is actually go outside the business when you're looking at culture. So go to your customers. I'm sure that most of the organizations that are on this session today will have a customer experience program. You'll go and ask questions to customers. One of the organizations we've done a lot of work with is Hilti. If you know anything about power tools, you'll know Hilti. But they have a fantastic thing called the Customer Bonding Index. And within there, they're actually asking, what do you think of us culturally and how we behave? And a really interesting one is to go into supply chain as well. Partners, suppliers, what do you think of us as a business? And you start to get some interesting insights about culture that way. So there's the good things you can do. I think there's one, if you like, all of the layers are important. Some are more important than others. And I think the one I just wanted to mention for a minute is really line managers, because I think you alluded to it before, Andrew, about that's where a lot of this change happens, where a lot of the cultural influence on people occurs, is at their line manager level. And there's this phrase, permafrost. I don't know if I did I can't remember whether I pinched it from you, Andrew, or not, whether it was one of yours, was it?
I have been known to use the phrase in the past.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, maybe it was.
But, I won't take credit for inventing the phrase. No.
You're not claiming it.
No.
But it does work. I think it visualises this really well. You know, and put yourself in the shoes of a line manager. It's a tough job, right? You've got all of this day-to-day operational things to deal with. You've got personnel management. You've got all the reports to do, and then somebody comes along and says, "Hey, by the way, we're going to change our culture. Can you sort that out?" And it's just really difficult. And you have to recognise that that's where a lot of the burden sits, and really support these people. So some of the things I think you can do is recognise that and help those line managers. Some of the examples we've seen are these kinds of communities, which are kind of almost like a walled garden community at peer level for line managers, so they can ask questions of each other, maybe some daft questions, asking for some advice, but do it within a closed environment, so it's not public. And it's twofold. It's asking the daft questions, but it's also sharing best practice. You know, what's worked for me actually within this culture change part, or within either the self-assessment or some of the change programs. This is what's been successful for us. So I think you have to recognise the need to support some people as part of this inclusion. And then the other element I wanted to talk about was enablement. And there's a good definition of enablement there, and really what we're talking about is the second point here around technology, how we can make it work. And I need to be a little bit careful, because of course this is what Questback does. So to be sort of hesitant, if I just stamp on my toe, Callum, if I switch into sales mode, I'll try not to. But I suppose there's three things which I think stand out. One is simplicity and making it easy for people. The second is automation, because this is a whole new bit of work, and if you can't automate it, the load becomes too heavy. And thirdly is insight. You know, once you go down this road, how do you actually take action? Because ultimately that's what's going to drive performance, and you're going to pick up performance in a minute, Andrew. And within that, there's just a few bits I wanted to highlight. And the first is what seems to be really trivial, but it's actually incredibly challenging, which is how you manage your organisation when you do this kind of exercise. How do you take the hierarchy of people that you have? And in large organisations, it's pretty complex. It's multi-level, multi-dimensional as well. It's by brand, by function, by region, matrix reporting, all these kinds of things. And if you start engaging with people, and some people have a view about one thing, think we have a controlling culture, and others disagree, how do you go back into those subsets of people and actually ask them follow-up questions and get them engaged and start to use them as champions potentially to drive some of that change? Because you need to be constantly going in and having different subsets and segments of the hierarchy, and understand who reports to who, and visibility, and all of these kinds of things. And having a technology capability to be able to keep that going in real time is incredibly valuable. If any of you have tried to run an annual engagement survey off spreadsheets and things like that, and outputs, you'll know how hard it is. Probably half the project time gets consumed with just managing that hierarchy, and that doesn't work if you're going to do something that's dynamic, like cultural analysis. So that was one point. The second is making it easy for people to get involved, and you need some kind of, as the title says there, digital home. You need some place where people can go to actually give you their voice about culture, to share with you what they think at a generic level, or a specific level, or a follow-up level. And increasingly we're seeing this done in things like mobile apps, where people can very easily engage, or it could be something done within a portal through a kind of single sign-on that sits linked to intranets or other tools you might have, a Yammer or a Chatter kind of tool, and linking in with those sorts of things, so people have single logins and an ability to contribute to this cultural dialogue. And that's a really important word, dialogue, around how you do this. And I think the final bit for me is this part around insight, and how you turn all of this data that you start to get, and all of these results and follow-up conversations, into something you can actually do something about. And that's really decision support. It's around visualizing the data you get and being able to see how it varies and put it in a way where you can interact with it intuitively and visually without the need to bring in data analysts or an insight team or something like that. Something you can put in the hands of managers to actually make decisions about it. And it's things thinking about vital signs and thinking about early warnings, so you start to see where the trend differences are or the comparative differences between teams or countries or brands or business units or whatever it is, and that just helps you to know where you are and be close to it, rather than it being a kind of annual cycle, which is just too long for doing things like culture. And just to sort of close with an example on this, some really interesting work with one of the investment banks last year, where they were actually churning about 50% of new recruits in the first 12 months. And when you put a cost to that, it's just astronomical. And they knew it was cultural and that people were coming in and leaving for cultural reasons. They weren't a good cultural fit. But once you started drilling into it, realised that actually there's a discrepancy, and that what hiring managers were looking for was what the stated culture was, which is, hey, we're a really team-based culture. So they're looking for that kind of cohesive kind of people and looking for people who have great team skills. Actually, what was lauded and what was successful in that organisation was very individualistic. So back to your slider questions, we were recruiting people at one end, but actually expecting them to perform in the other. And
I imagine that ties in with the self-awareness piece as well. Is this, that they're advertising a culture that is actually inaccurate because they're not maybe self-aware of what is actually their culture.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that a lack of self-awareness is liable to lead to is a lack of authenticity. Both in terms of what your organisation is and values and stands for, and also at the level of your leadership. Because a lack of awareness of the impact of your leadership style on those around you will lead to a lack of authenticity.
Yeah.
And that, as we know, is a key part of leadership.
An important word. So bringing it back to enablement and how you can solve that, what they actually are doing to address that is having a self-awareness survey which actually rates people on various scores, and not doing it at what the hiring manager is looking for, but doing it with people who've been successful in that role, who are a year or two in, and then looking at the comparatives to what self-awareness they're getting from candidates who are actually applying for the role. So thinking about that kind of candidate experience, and part of the recruitment process is to do some cultural assessments there and start to map with people who are successful in role. So that kind of thing would be incredibly laborious if you had to do it manually, but the ability to have to bake in some of that process through technology can be quite powerful. And ultimately, that example, it was about driving a huge cost line around retention of people and recruitment of people, which brings it on to performance and financial performance, which I think you're going to take this bit, Andrew, right?
Yes, as I mentioned at the start, we don't look at assessing organisational culture and changing organisational culture for its own sake. We're looking to increase the effectiveness of the organisation in general terms and the performance of that organisation. And the way we conceptualise performance is in the broadest sense in terms of employee engagement. Are you bringing your employees along on the journey that you require them to follow? Are you involving them in the process? Are you bringing your customers with you and attracting and retaining your customers? And are you achieving the business outputs that you're looking for? And obviously, when you're quite mature in the measurement of the culture, you can measure how the culture is influencing these outputs in terms of engagement and customer satisfaction and business performance, and tailoring your approach to changing the culture and the behaviours exhibited within that to maximise the organisational performance in a holistic sense. And this too requires balance between engaging your people, getting results from them, and serving your customers and retaining them. So one of the questions that I'm asked quite often is around how does an assessment of culture differ from an employee engagement survey? And I think some of the examples I've shown you here have been illustrative of that. as Paul said, you want to make the process of being involved in a survey as easy as possible for people. You want to give them easy access to the survey. But actually, thinking about culture and responding about culture demands a considered, thought-through response. You're asking people to give quite a lot of cognitive effort in terms of thinking about the culture, thinking about the behaviours that illustrate that and the changes that are required. So a sort of block of 5-point response scales from strongly agree to strongly disagree isn't going to do it for you. What tends to happen is people respond very quickly in straight lines down through the survey. Culture, as I said, requires thought and consideration and quality conversations. So what you need is to design a tool which gives rise to those conversations, that dialogue, and includes the tools and incorporates the tools to facilitate that kind of dialogue. And hopefully, today we've given you some pointers into how you can start better understanding your culture and start proactively managing it.
We've just had a question that's come through actually that says, it's from Teresa. She said, I can see the value in empowering managers to own the data and self-analyze, but is there a fear that you may end up with antagonizing cultures where managers are doing their own thing?
Hopefully not, because the fun premise behind this is that you, through your strategic objectives, you're able to articulate quite clearly where you are, where you need to be, and what kind of management behaviours are required to get you to where you need to be. So hopefully it will actually clarify across your management population what the changes are that need to take place. The benefit of focusing on behaviours rather than attitudes in your questions is you don't really need to sit around and scratch your head about what do these responses actually mean. The clue is in the question. The discussion is not what do we do, but how do we do it. We need to empower our people to take more responsibility for the decisions that they take on a day-to-day basis rather than just relying on fixed rules. How do we do that? And hopefully to have that kind of focus allows that kind of consistency and gets away from those managers moving in different directions.
Yeah, and I just support that. I think it's a really good question, and there is a danger, certainly, that the key, I would say, is to bring it back to the data and have those early warning signs. So have the link between the cultural self-assessment that's going on in the teams and of the managers and the performance as well. And it really stacks. You know, I was with one of our biggest global customers yesterday, and they look at key drivers of performance through that kind of service to profit chain, and they've changed it this year and added a specific cultural alignment question. So and they found that it really stacks. If people with the management level or within a team are aligned to the culture and feel it's where they should be, the performance is significantly different than people who feel kind of culturally misaligned. So those kinds of tracking that as an early warning, I think, is a way of mitigating that risk.
Talking of examples, someone's asked if if an organisation is defined as controlling in that model that we saw earlier, driving success from the bottom up can therefore be quite difficult maybe to initiate. So have you seen in your experience an example of where maybe this has actually been successful, where it was undertaken, and can you offer any tips?
Yes. There was an organisation that we've been working with recently who had very control culture, quite paternalistic. That was expressed very much through the role of the line manager played within team discussions and tended to dominate discussions. So they changed the rules about how the team discussions were to be conducted. And once every quarter, they moved to a model where they had input only from the team members, and the managers themselves played more of a facilitative role. They didn't dominate the discussion, sat very much back and let the employees themselves, the team members themselves, dictate the agenda and discuss the issues that were important to them. It was then that the manager became involved and uploaded the outputs from those onto a central portal where the issues were made available and condensed into the kinds of things that people were talking about. So then that was a cultural change in as much as it required the managers to sit back, really allow the teams themselves to dictate the agenda and talk about what they wanted to talk about. But actually the interesting thing about that was it was done in quite a controlled way. It wasn't swimming completely against the tide because they were required to upload their responses in a sort of a control-like way. So there were elements of the culture which were still retained to make sure that people actually did it. But going forward, there'll be much less of that, I imagine, as that embeds itself in the culture and it becomes more of a sort of this is the way we do things in a more general sense.
Evolution, not revolution. And I think that's right. I see that too. And but I think most businesses today are evidence-based. You know, they're data-driven in how they make decisions. If you can shine a light on this stuff and show that it does make a difference and it does have value, then that's normally the best way to get attention at senior level.
Megan's been in touch and she said that we have a lot of highly engaged lower-level employees. However, we struggle as our leadership team are not embodying the desired behaviours. What would you suggest as an approach to managing their understanding of the importance of culture?
I think the key to it is self-awareness. It plays an absolute fundamental role in how managers see themselves and how their behaviour impacts upon those around them. And actually to have a kind of feedback on perhaps not individual managers, but the management and leadership environment more generally. Actually, how would they rate themselves on those behavioural questions? And does that marry with the way they are perceived by the people whom they manage? And often there's a mismatch, and that's often down to a lack of self-awareness about what they do and how they do it impacts upon those around them. And that's a very important skill for managers to develop. And it doesn't necessarily come naturally, but when you hold a mirror up to them in this kind of way, it can be very enlightening.
Yeah, you're right. Those kind of multi-rater graphics that come out of where as managers, how do you think people are going to answer this, and then actually how did they answer it? And it's pretty stark sometimes if you've got that kind of lack of buy-in to the importance. But again, you have to turn it into business KPIs. You have to prove a link to profitability and shareholder value and the kinds of things that really ultimately sit behind decision making in boardrooms. So that's always an essential part. You have to be prepared for that, I think.
Excellent. It all reminds me of, I was talking to you just before the webinar actually, is at our annual event, one of our speakers, she talked about quite a colourful example of culture in the form of a story about penguins and a peacock. Now, please don't exit the webinar now. There is relevance. It was all about an organisation that was, it was Penguin Corporation or something like that. Everyone's a penguin, everyone's black and white. Suddenly they recruit a peacock because they feel that there is penguin potential in this individual, which instantly becomes sort of an issue. The peacock was very creative, and it's almost one of these controlling organisations that you've mentioned before. But I think in terms of maybe sort of self-awareness, again, inclusion and general performance, it's highlighted really well in this story. I would suggest maybe looking up on YouTube. There's a much more lengthy story to tell, but basically the peacock is faced with the dilemma of whether or not to stay and force themselves into a penguin suit and become more penguin, or whether the penguins become more inclusive and adopt the different types of birds into their organisation. It's a really nice, colourful way to say what we've been talking about today. So I thought I'd share that. But no, I think it's been a really engaged topic, really.
So is that our next final poll question? Are you a penguin or a peacock?
Exactly. But well, excellent. And a few people have been asking whether the slides will be available. Yes, they will. And also the white paper that Questback have done around this related issue So thank you all for participating. It was slightly longer than the promised half an hour, but I think you'll agree that it was worth it. And you've all stayed and stuck around, so you've clearly found it very engaging. A lot of thank yous for examples and tips coming through as well. So thank you again to both of you. Thank you to Andrew. Thank you to Paul.
That's a pleasure.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks everyone.